The history of Donkey Kong, how it was developed, why it was developed, the legal troubles that were surrounding it, how it took off, and a whole range of other things that you don't know about this game. That's what we're going to be talking about in this video. Before we do that, I'm Mister. Welcome back to the channel. If you're brand new here, just take a moment now, hit that subscribe button for all kinds of daily uploads of various gaming related content. Now about Donkey Kong. It was one of the first, if not the first, platform game at a time when games like that were not even called platform games. And when Donkey Kong first came out, it was kind of thought of as a climbing game, not a platform game. Now, it is the first game to feature jumping. So before this one came out, there were no video games that actually had a character jumping. And as we're going to see later on, what we'll also be looking at is how Mario came about, how his look came about, and how the graphics of the day were at fault. Now, one of the other things that was unique about Donkey Kong at the time was that it had 4 unique stages. So, as we're going to discover later on, the game developers that were working on it were kind of like a little bit annoyed because to them it was like working on 4 different games. Instead of just one game that had a repetitive stage that maybe got harder, it appeared to them that they were working on 4 different games. Because it had 4 different games or 4 different stages, it tended to be more complex than any of the other games. Now, it wasn't the first game to have different stages. It was the first game to use defined cutscenes and also to progress the story, which we'll cover again also as we move on. Now, some of the other games, or one of the more famous ones that comes to my mind when I think about stages in a game, is the game Scramble, where you start off flying over a mountain range, then you start off flying over concrete, then there are caves, then there is an open field with asteroids coming at you, and then you're back through into constructed area. Now, one of the other things about Donkey Kong was that it was thought to actually be a little bit more difficult than other games because it required you to sort of think through the game. If you could identify a pattern after many gameplay, then yes, that definitely helped you get through the levels. Also, just about everything you did in this game earned you points. You jumped over a barrel, you smashed a barrel, you jumped over a join to pop a rivet or so on and so forth. All of these things added you points. Now, generally, you did start off with 3 lives in the game and you did get an extra life awarded at 7,000 points. Each of the game's levels is designated as 25 meters. So it's a 100-meter high game. Each level is 25 meters. And basically what happens is Donkey Kong is considered the bad guy. He has kidnapped the main character's girlfriend. Her name is Pauline. Now, what's interesting, as we're going to discover, is where the name Pauline came from and where the name Mario came from as well. So Donkey Kong steals Mario's girlfriend, and therefore Mario has to try and rescue her. So it was also one of the very first games that had a damsel in distress feel about it as well. The game uses graphics and animations, obviously, for characterization. Donkey Kong kind of smirks when Mario takes a dive. Pauline has a pink dress and she's got long hair with a speech balloon that cries out, "Help." Now, Mario is actually depicted in red overalls and a red cap. Now, he's typically thought of as the everyman character, a type that was common in Japan at the time. Now, the graphical limitations and the low pixel resolutions of the small sprites actually forced his design because drawing a mouth with such few pixels was not quite feasible, so he was given a mustache instead. And because they could not animate his hair, they gave him a cap on his head. And to make his arm movements visible while he was running, they had to give him coloured overalls. So his look was determined by the features or the limitations of graphics as it was at the time. Donkey Kong is one of the first examples of a story that also is told in video game form, and that is it uses cutscenes to advance the story. Of course, the game opens with a gorilla climbing the ladders to the top of the construction site, then he jumps up and down, causing the beams to go out of shape, and then he starts throwing barrels. That's stage 1. Then you go to stage 2 where you've got conveyor belts and so on and so forth. So every time Mario gets to Pauline, then we've got another scene that means he has another mission to accomplish as well. The thing was, with the development of the game, Nintendo actually wanted to break into the American market, and they had tried a game called Radar Scope. I'm not a big fan of Radar Scope. I would rather have played Space Invaders or Galaxians or something like that. Obviously, the American market didn't adopt Radar Scope as much as Nintendo had hoped either, and they were left over with a large number of Radar Scope boxes, cabinets, circuitry, and so on. And so the company president, he thought, well, why don't we just convert those into a different game? So he approached Shigeru Miyamoto, who had been working for Nintendo since 1977, to see if he could actually design a replacement. And Miyamoto said that he figured he could. And the development budget given was $100,000. Now remember, we're talking early 80s here. If you think of a house, say, being worth around $25,000, maybe around that time, possibly, $100,000 would be the equivalent of 4 houses. At the time, Nintendo was also trying to license a game based on the Popeye comic strip, but when that failed, they thought this was a good opportunity to create a brand new character that they could then market and use in later games. They were creating a character now that they hoped to use in games further on. Even though the designer did come up with many characters and plot concepts, he eventually settled on a love triangle between the gorilla, the carpenter, and of course his girlfriend, because it kind of mirrored the rivalry between Bluto and Popeye for olive oil. In this case, Bluto became the ape, which the developer said was nothing too evil or repulsive, and he'd be part of the main character. He was a kind of a funny, hang loose kind of a guy. He also named Beauty and the Beast and the film King Kong as influences on his designing. Although its origin as a comic strip license played a major part, Donkey Kong marked the first time the storyline for a video game preceded the game programming rather than simply being appended after the thought. Unrelated Popeye games would eventually be released by Nintendo, of course, for the Game & Watch, but back then, we're talking about arcades. Even though the Nintendo boss wanted to target North America mainly, he mandated that the game be given an English title. Many of their games to this point had English titles anyway, so that didn't really matter too much. But the designer decided to name the game for the ape because he felt the ape was the strongest character. How he came up with the name of Donkey Kong varies. A false urban myth says the name was originally meant to be Monkey Kong, but was misspelt or misinterpreted due to a blurred fax or telephone or something like that. So that one is phony. That's fake. Now, a more credible story claims that he looked in the Japanese-English dictionary for something that would mean stubborn gorilla, or that donkey was meant to convey silly or stubborn, and we all know donkeys can be quite stubborn. And Kong was a common Japanese slang word for gorilla back in the day. A rival claim is that he worked with Nintendo's export manager to come up with a title, and that donkey was meant to represent stupid and goofy. But either way, in the end, he stated that he thought the name would convey the thought of a stupid ape. Now, he did have high hopes for the project himself, even though he lacked the technical skills to program it entirely. So he came up with the concepts and consulted technicians to see if they were possible. He wanted to make the characters different sizes, move them in different manners, and react in various ways. Even though the supervisor thought his design was too complex, he had some difficult suggestions himself, such as seeing seesaws used to catapult a hero. He had actually wanted those done as well, but they turned out to be too hard to program. Now, he did think of using the sloped platforms, the barrels and the ladders, and when he specified that the game would have multiple stages, the programming team complained because to them, as I already said, it was like asking them to make the game repeatedly. Nevertheless, they did go with what he said, and they created a total of, you ready for this? 20 kilobytes of content. Today, when a mobile game downloads and it's 70 megabytes, they created 20 kilobytes of content. The circuit board of the Radar Scope game was restructured for Donkey Kong, and the hardware, originally inspired by Namco Galaxian's hardware, was designed for a large number of enemies moving around at high speeds, but Donkey Kong doesn't require it. So the development team had to remove the unnecessary functions and they reduced the size of the circuit board. Now, while the gameplay and the graphics were reworked for the updated ROM chips, the existing CPU, sound hardware, and the monitors were left as they were. The character set, scoreboard, upper HUD display, and the font, they're almost identical to Radar Scope, and there's some little color differences. The Donkey Kong hardware has the memory capacity for displaying 128 foreground sprites at 16 by 16 pixels each, and 256 background tiles at 8 by 8 pixels each. Mario and all the moving objects use single sprites. The taller Pauline uses 2 sprites, and the large Donkey Kong uses 16 sprites. Hiroshi Yamauchi thought the game was going to sell well and phoned to inform Arakawa, head of Nintendo's operations in the US and Nintendo's American distributors. Ron, Judy, and Al Stone brought Arakawa to a lawyer named Howard Lincoln to secure the trademark. The game was sent to Nintendo of America for testing, and the sales manager disliked it because it was too different from the typical maze and shooter games that were common at the time. But Judy and Lincoln expressed reservations over the strange title, but still, Arakawa admittedly believed it'd be a hit, so thank goodness that he held his ground. American staff began translating the storyline for the cabinet art, naming the characters. They chose Pauline over Lady after Polly James, who was the wife of warehouse manager in Redmond, Washington, Don James, his wife Polly James. Originally, Mario had been called Jumpman in Japan. They were thinking something like Pac-Man, Walkman, something like that. But they changed it to Mario because they thought he kind of looked like Mario Segale, who was the landlord of the original office space of Nintendo in America. Now, the characters were printed on the American cabinet art and used in promotional materials, and Donkey Kong was ready for release. Stone and Judy convinced the managers of 2 bars in Seattle, in Washington, to set up Donkey Kong machines. And the managers initially, they were kind of reluctant, but when they saw the sales of $30 a day or 120 plays for a week straight, they requested more units. In their Redmond headquarters, a skeleton crew composed of Arakawa, his wife, Yoko, James, Judy, Phillips, and Stone set about gutting 2,000 surplus Radar Scope machines and converting them with Donkey Kong motherboards and power supplies from Japan. That's a lot of work. The game officially went on sale in July 1981. Makers of video game consoles, following the release, they were also interested. Taito offered a lot of money to buy the rights to Donkey Kong, but Nintendo turned them down after 3 days of discussing it. And rivals companies of Coleco and Atari obviously approached Nintendo in Japan and in the United States. In the end, the license was granted to Coleco exclusively for consoles and tabletop rights to the Donkey Kong game because it was believed that Coleco was the hungriest company. In addition, Arakawa believed that as more established company in the US, Coleco could better handle marketing, and in return, Nintendo would receive an undisclosed sum plus $1.40 per game cartridge sold and $1 per tabletop unit. On December 24, 1981, Lincoln drafted the contract. He included language Coleco would be held liable for anything on the game cartridge, an unusual clause for a licensing agreement at the time. Arakawa signed the document the next day, and on February 1, 1982, Coleco representatives were persuaded in Japan to sign without reviewing it by their own company lawyers. So they took a big punt as well. Coleco didn't offer the game cartridges standalone though, because they bundled it with ColecoVision console, which went on sale in August 82. 6 months later, Coleco offered Atari and Intellivision versions as well. The company didn't port it to the Atari 5200, a system comparable to its own, obviously. Coleco sales doubled to 500 million and its earnings quadrupled to 40 million. Coleco's console versions of Donkey Kong sold 6 million cartridges in total and grossed over $153 million and earning Nintendo more than $5 million in royalties, Coleco also released standalone mini-arcade tabletop versions of Donkey Kong, which along with Pac-Man, Galaxian and Frogger sold 3 million units combined. Meanwhile, Atari got the license for computer versions of Donkey Kong and released it for the Atari 400 and 800. When Coleco unveiled the Atom computer, running a port of Donkey Kong at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago in 1983, Atari protested it was violating the licensing agreement, and of course it was demanded. They ended up pulling that port for the Atom's computer. In 1983, Atari released several computer versions under the Atari Soft label. All of the ports had the cement factory level, while most of the console versions did not. None of the home versions have all of the intermission animations from the arcade game. Some have Donkey Kong on the left side of the screen in the barrel level, and others have him on the right. Also, the developer of the game created a simplified version for the Game & Watch multi-screen handheld device, of which I had one a long time ago. And apparently I just looked up on eBay. They go for anywhere from $150 to $200 now, and I saw one for sale at a gaming shop in Australia for $500. At the time they came out in Australia, they were worth $40. Other versions of Donkey Kong were also released on things like Intellivision, the Commodore VIC-20, and so on. The game did get ported to Nintendo's family computer, Famicom, but it was released in Japan on July 1983. The NES version was released as an unlockable game in Animal Crossing for the GameCube. It was also published on Virtual Console for the Wii, the Wii 2 and the Nintendo 3DS. And the Wii U version is also the last game that was released to celebrate the 30-year anniversary of the Japanese version of the NES, the Famicom. The original arcade version of the game appears in the Nintendo 64 game Donkey Kong 64 and must be beaten to finish the game. Nintendo released the NES version to the e-reader and for the Game Boy Advance Classics NES series in 2002 and 2004 respectively, and Namco released an arcade cabinet which contains Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr. and Mario Brothers in 2004. In his book of 1982 called Video Invaders, Steve Bloom described Donkey Kong as another bizarre cartoon game courtesy of Japan. However, it was very popular in the United States and Canada and in Australia too, I might add. The game initially sold 2,000 units and more orders were made. Obviously, remember, they had to re-gut the 2,000 units of radar scope that they had. Arakawa began manufacturing the electronic components in Redmond, Washington, because waiting for the shipments from Japan was taking too long, and by October Donkey Kong was selling 4,000 units a month, and by late June 1982 Nintendo had sold 60,000 Donkey Kong machines throughout all of America and pocketed $180 million. Judy and Stone, who worked on straight commissions, became millionaires obviously. Arakawa used Nintendo's profits to buy 27 acres of land in Redmond, and Nintendo earned another $100 million on the game in its second year of release, totaling $280 million in console sales, which in 2018 money works out to be $771 million. From arcade machine sales of Donkey Kong, and it remained Nintendo's top seller into the mid-83s. It sold steadily in Japan, and Electronic Games speculated in June 83 the game's home version contributed to the arcade version's extended popularity because generally the arcade machines would only be popular for maybe 4 to 6 months. In April 1982, a lawyer and president of MCA and Universal City Studios, which we would today know as Universal Films, for example, learned of course, the game's success and suspected it might be a trademark infringement on their owning of King Kong. Further in April, they met with Coleco and threatened to sue over Coleco's home version of Donkey Kong. Coleco agreed to pay royalties to Universal of 3% of their net price, which was worth about $4.6 million at the time. Meanwhile, the lawyer revoked Tiger's license to make its King Kong game. They'd hired someone to make a King Kong game, but Tiger refused to acknowledge Universal's claim to the trademark. When Universal threatened Nintendo, Howard Lincoln and Nintendo refused to cave in, and in preparation for the court battle ahead, Universal agreed to allow Tiger to then continue producing its King Kong game, as long as they distinguished it from the Donkey Kong game. Universal sued Nintendo in June 82 and announced its license with Coleco. The company sent cease and desist letters to Nintendo's licensees, all of which agreed to pay royalties, except Milton Bradley and Ralston Purina. Universal Studios versus Nintendo was heard in the US District Court for the Southern District of New York, and over 7 days, Universal's counsel argued that the name King Kong and Donkey Kong were easily confused, and the plot of the game was an infringement on that of their films. Nintendo's counsel, John Kirby, countered that Universal had themselves argued in a previous case that King Kong's scenario and characters were in the public domain. The judge ruled in Nintendo's favour, awarding the company Universal's profits from Tiger's game of $56,000, also damages and also attorney fees. Of course, Universal appealed, trying to prove consumer confusion by presenting the results of a telephone survey and examples from print media where people had allegedly assumed a connection between the two Kongs. On October 84, however, the court also upheld the previous verdict. Nintendo and its licensees filed counterclaims against Universal. The judge awarded Nintendo $1.8 million for legal fees, lost revenues and other expenses, however, denied the claim of damages from those licensees who'd already paid royalties to both Nintendo and Universal. Both parties appealed the judgment, but the verdict remained. Nintendo thanked John Kirby with a gift of $30,000 sailboat named Donkey Kong and exclusive worldwide rights to use the name for sailboats. And a later Nintendo protagonist was named in Kirby's honour. And what the court battle taught Nintendo was that they could compete with larger entertainment companies. And as we know, following the fantastic reception of the original Donkey Kong, we had Donkey Kong Jr., Donkey Kong 3, Donkey Kong Country, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, Mario vs. Donkey Kong 2, and so on and so on and so on. And of course, we all know Mario now became the figure or the main character behind Nintendo after he broke free of the Donkey Kong game itself. In popular culture, we also know the phrase, "It's on like Donkey Kong." And what happened here, it's originally that just is a phrase that just sprung up by itself out of nowhere. But Nintendo in 2010 applied for a trademark on the phrase with the Patent and Trademarks Office. Like all games at the time, of course, everyone was out to get the world record highest score. In a documentary called The King of Kong, A Fistful of Quarters, it tells the story of Steve Wiebe's attempt to break the Donkey Kong world record, which was considered to be held by Billy Mitchell. In early 2010, Hank Chien set a record of 1,138,600 points, and it was broken 4 years later by Robbie Lakeman. The current world record is set by Robbie Lakeman in 2018 with a score of 1,247,700 points. In 2018 also, Mitchell, who was considered to have the first record, was stripped of his records by Twin Galaxies and banned from submitting new scores after they discovered and concluded that he had used emulators to achieve his scores. In other words, he cheated because high scores prohibit the use of emulators and you just cannot do undetectable cheating, which is what an emulator helps you to do. And they had somehow detected or found out that he had used that. And that is about it. There is much more to be said about clone games that came out with Donkey Kong and a possible Easter egg in an Atari game, legacies, so on and so forth. We know that Mario came out of it and that all up, the game was a tremendous hit for Nintendo, and you could almost say set Nintendo as a world-breaking maker of games on the path that they now have. Everything is running on the back of Mario, and everyone loves Mario. And to think that Mario's characterization was a forced result of the reduction in graphical ability at the time that Donkey Kong came out, is just amazing to think about that. And that's all I've got for this video. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think of the game. Have you played it? Have you found it too hard or too difficult or even too easy? Did you play it in arcade? Have you played it at home on any of the other consoles, or have you played one of the Flash games online? I'll leave a link to a Flash game online. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. And until next time, thanks for watching.